Hi, everyone.
Hello. We're going to let everybody come in for a bit. And after you say your hellos, if you can just mute your mics, that would be awesome.
Hello.
Let me see what. Okay, down there again.
Hopefully everyone has their glass of wine, because this is going to be, we might need a couple glasses of wine after the AI discussion.
Okay.
I can see James has his, he's set. Okay. We're going to continue to let people in as we move forward. And so I just wanted to thank everybody for joining us on this session about AI in the art world. And we're going to talk a little bit about AI in general, as well as how it pertains to the art world. This is going to be a fairly open conversation, more like a fireside chat versus a presentation. And partially that's because we're all kind of learning here, and this whole AI movement is moving so quickly. So I'd like Judy Ann to do the land acknowledgement, please.
The Artist Network and the Leslie Grove Gallery acknowledge the traditional territories of the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Wendat peoples. These territories are the enduring home to many First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples from across Turtle Island. We acknowledge that we are hosted on land covered by Treaty 13, held by the Mississaugas of the Credit. Toronto is subject to the Dish with One Spoon Covenant, which bound the Anishinaabe, Mississaugas, and the Haudenosaunee peoples to peacefully share and protect the lands of the Great Lakes. In the spirit of this covenant, we are grateful to be able to meet, create, and grow together in the spirit of peace, friendship, and respect on this ancestral land.
Thanks, Judy Ann. I guess I should have introduced myself. So I'm Kate Taylor, chair of the education committee now. So I had to rethink that, not chair of the organization anymore. And we've got James Fowler and Mark Gleberzon joining us today to talk about AI in the art world. Both of these gentlemen will do a little bit of an introduction to what they do and what they're interested in. But both of them have been very involved in kind of, I guess, leading edge technologies, understanding the impact on the art world. So we will talk about what AI is, how is it made, how does it affect the art world, how do we as artists need to protect ourselves, how can we potentially use it to kind of forward our art career. And I think that we will have a fairly open conversation. So if people have questions, you may ask them, or we will have a Q&A period at the end of the day, end of the session as well, so that you will have lots of opportunities. So Mark, do you want to give a little bit of who you are and why you care about AI?
My name is Mark Gleberzon, and you can hear me?
Yep.
I wasn't sure. Okay, good. So I'm Mark Gleberzon. I've been a working artist for 30 years. I've currently with a collective. I know that you had an earlier conversation about a collective scenario. So I have a collective that includes Morgan Jones and a number of other artists, including Patrick Skull. I'm actually leaving at the end of the month, as is Morgan. In 2011 to 2015, I had my own art gallery. I have, like a lot of you, I've done far too many shows that I'd like to list throughout Canada, the States, Japan. There's some artwork that was sent to Paris, and I almost don't know where to begin. I've done art history lectures at York University. I have also presented a number of art lecture series through Ryerson when they used to have, or actually they still currently have, an incentive called Learning is Forever, the Life Institute. So I would talk about things going on in the contemporary art world, the auction scene, talk about certain artists, and to some degree technology, and their technologies and innovations were a part of that.
Cool.
So there we go.
Thanks, Mark. James?
I'm just a guy. Mark, you're so
With a granny square.
You're so accomplished. Yeah, I'm just a guy who knits or crochets granny's clothes. So my name is James Fowler. I'm first and foremost an artist. I have written art and tech for Akimbo in the past. Like many people who are Gen X, I have noted the 60 or 100 plus wonderful new technology inventions since my birth. And I've taken note, and I have an interest in that. I have an interest in technology, I have an interest in art, and I have an interested in the humanities. I'm really interested in how technology changes our culture, and I'm a big advocate for community building through various means. And I'm just really interested to see how these new technologies have an impact on us as a whole, as a culture, but also on the art community, as individuals, and as a group.
Thank you. So, I think that we all, us of a certain age, have seen many technologies that have been very disruptive. And we know that when new technology comes in place, it creates a lot of anxiety and a lot of stress, although it changes the things, the way that people move forward, and in some ways for the good, and things get incorporated into your daily life and you don't think of them as being disruptive anymore. So, I think AI sounds like it really came into the forefront around 2022, very powerful, very controversial. I think it leads to questions for artists as to whether or not the real artists will be forgotten. What happens when people use their technology or their imagery without permission? So maybe we can kind of chart a little bit about, what is AI and where do you see it in the art world? I know that's a very open question.
My goodness. Mark, you want to take that?
Well, I think with the concept of artificial intelligence, it's the utilization of, to some degree, the unknown, because the technology, it's like very $6 million man. We have the technology, we can use it. What do we do with it? And I think part of the concern is sometimes it's like you've got so many people going through a single door that they get stuck, and you almost have so many ideas and so many people trying to find that singular identity by using it, that I think it gets very muddled in terms of the implications. So it's one thing that we can incorporate and utilize the technology where you can go onto a site and say, do an image of a landscape on Venus with a unicorn and this and that, and you'll get an interpretation of AI, which will essentially screen grab from other imagery that is already to be found in the interweb, and it will sort of personalize it to what you're sort of asking for and put it into that place. And I think the concern is, our copyright laws being broken, our design concepts being broken and being borrowed and appropriated. I think there's a lot of moral issues, and there's a lot to be said that even the people who are instrumentally using AI in their art even they are showing concern because they are so unsure how quickly the technology and the fact that so many people can get into it, that there may be some more darker implications. I mean, when you talk about things like dark fakes and all that, that's another realm, but that could also be incorporated into art as well. So I think there's a lot of implications in that. You can look at AI as a marvelous tool, an asset to our creative process. Doesn't matter what medium you work with. I think you could still find the use of AI in a very positive way by the fact that it can get information and huge pixelated images to you within seconds without having to go and do individual searches. I think there's a lot of pluses and perhaps more scary minuses that are in consideration with the utilization of the technology, because part of the problem, I know I'm rambling on here, but part of the problem also is, as I'm listening to more podcasts, is the concern of regulations. Who's going to regulate how people are going to use it, how it's going to be used, and to what degree does a personalized voice of a singular artist get seen when perhaps it gets diluted because AI in itself might borrow again from so many different sources to create a singular image that you think is personalized to you, but it may indeed actually be made up of different design structures from other sources that have already existed, and it just sort of brings them all together into a singular image. So there's a lot of interesting implications to consider.
And a huge amount to unpack in that. So James, did you want to add anything additional to that?
I think I'll give you an analogy to answer that question. when we think about setting goals for a year, sometimes that can be really daunting and we're not very specific about them. So I think when we talk about things like AI, just like goal setting, that we need to be really specific about how we speak about it. So when you say AI is like a huge topic, and it goes into many industries. So for the purpose of this talk, we're talking about how it impacts artists, but you can also break AI down into sort of subfields, right? So things like robotics or computer vision or machine learning or deep learning, and sort of unpack what those are, and then look at maybe like how artists are using them. Because I think some artists are, when we sort of scratch the surface and we think about AI, people will go to things like sort of machine learn tools that have been given these massive data sets where you can, like Mark was saying, you can request, you can give it a prompt to say, I want these and these and these things in an image, and it will spit something out. We have to keep in mind that those images are only gathered together from the data sets that are supplied to it.
And I guess actually technically, so I was just going to say technically, it's actually really not artificial intelligence because they aren't adding an intelligence factor to it. It really is heavy duty machine learning.
Right. I was actually reviewing some of the chapters in a book called The Creative Code. I'm going to butcher the person's last name, but it's Marcus de Sautoy. It's Sautoy. And one of the things that I thought was really interesting at the very beginning of the book, he talks about how AI is really good at some things, right? I've heard a lot of people talk about in any field, AI is sort of like having a really great assistant who's way smarter than you, who can source information faster than you, who can glean from that information and give you sort of a distilled report based on a whole bunch of data for you. But there's some things that AI is not good at, and I think that that's where we can take some solace so far on our use and how we can work collaboratively with machines, with AI. So things like, if you think about, if you look at the art history and how we've had these movements, a lot of movements are founded on the movement that came before. If you think about like different styles of music, and within that style of music, there's going to be subgenres. And if you look at history, each one has had an impact on the next by going sort of to the edges of that genre or that subgenre or that style, and then all of a sudden there's this break and it becomes another style. So we have exploration, but then there's also something that AI is really good at is a combinational creativity. So take A and B and C and D and put them all together and make me this sort of fantastical creature. It's really good at taking a whole bunch of things that's been supplied and giving you mix and matching all of these different things. What AI is not good at is transformational. And what I mean by that is that perfect storm, when somebody has had a certain experience, these experiences through life, and then they're maybe working with someone else, and that person comes with a whole set of experience, the way bands work, right? So you have a drummer and you have guitar players, and you have somebody who comes in who plays, I don't know, the harpsichord, or plays like a different instrument that maybe wouldn't be in a rock band. And all of a sudden you have this new genre, and there's a break from what's happened before. I haven't seen it. I haven't seen AI be able to, and I've been testing things where you try and say, hey, make me this and this and this. And what it does is, and you can see it, you can see where it's pulling that data from to create one thing, but it's not producing something that is a eureka. It's not producing something that is genuinely new thinking. And I think that while technologists and researchers are working on this, it's not there. It's nowhere close what we can do as human beings.
What's your thought on that, Mark? I mean, considering that AI has really come to its own in the last year, it feels to me like there's an awful lot of opportunity and runway to get closer to that.
Oh, there's some phenomenal things. I mean, there's a bunch of AI artists and designers I follow on Instagram, and I'll gladly list some of those just even for the reference, because some of the visuals are just absolutely amazing of what they come up with. But I think, you know, we talked about this in an earlier meeting, and that was the idea that anything that is new is always immediately perceived as a threat, in the sense when Photoshop came out nearly 30 years ago, it was fear that it was going to just completely wipe out an entire industry of professionals and designers, because now the person who's actually creating an ad campaign or a visual was then able to do all the cleanup and editing and clean up the lines and do all that in almost you know, using their own computer and keyboard in one singular tool. And then, you know, you think of things like Photoshop, PowerPoint and other modes like that, that these technologies come out, and as a singular designer is able to now incorporate all these different elements into a presentation, into a visual, and do it on their own. And that's the concern with AI, that where, you know, an entire movie could perhaps one day, and probably not that far away, could one day be completely created by a singular person who went on ChatGPT to write me the script. And then they were able to do all the storyboarding and all the visuals and the directing and incorporate any CGI technology and any of those sort of visuals. They can singularly create an entire movie.
Well, I understand that's
AI, and that's probably not that far away. And listen to some of these podcasts. That's the fear, that part of, if you want to be competitive and use AI effectively, that you sort of have to have your toes in the water. You can't always expect to be able to keep up with other people, like quote unquote younger people. I mean, you look at the demographic we're in, you're looking at 40s to 60s. So we're not going to grasp the technology as easily as younger people will, but you still sort of need to have a sense of what the capabilities are of these new technologies.
Well, and I gather speaking specifically of script writing, I've got that's already happening, because I know people who are very concerned about their jobs as script writers, especially, you know, not for these deep art movies maybe, but for things that are pretty basic, run of the mill, you know.
Yeah, copywriting, just copyright in general.
Yeah.
So there's an artist named Ross Goodwin who fed AI. So it used to this garbage in, garbage out, and the synthesis of this. So he took a whole bunch of classic sci-fi movies and fed it to this AI and asked the AI to write a script for a movie. And it spit out, and it was like, I think they put in 100 movies like Jurassic Park and all these alien movies. And Alien, and it spit out this script, and he got together and it basically they did a script breakdown for him with like the prompts that they needed, and he got together with a bunch of actors who hadn't seen his script, and they actually made it. It's called Sunspring. You can see it online. But like, I think this stuff is already happening. Like, but
Yeah.
you know, like I was saying, you know, it's only able to create content that is based on the data that it has in its database. And so and it's not good at coming up with something new. So if you say, I want a movie that's like the TV show The Flintstones, and it's a horror movie and it has Muppets in it, it's going to pull maybe lines from various scripts that it might have access to, or the data that it already has, but it's not going to create a new Muppet character. It's not going to come up with a whole new identity on its own.
But how, I mean, just to be a bit of a devil's advocate, I mean, you know, many artists don't come up with, not every single artist has a brand new and completely innovative approach to what their art is. I mean, you know, they definitely have their style, but if you're painting, you know, trees in a Tom Thompson format or whatever, there is a certain formula there, which, you know, one could argue is something that, even though, because you're internalizing and your hand is real there, is it that different than, say, for example, the person that just won one of the art contests, but he put in like, what, 85 hours of trying to figure out these inputs. I don't know, you can kind of see where the tools are different, but the amount of effort that goes into it is maybe still pretty substantial.
I think that comes with transparency, right? And we get into this whole conversation about authorship, right? And who is given credit for producing something when someone has created a prompt, and then that prompt is outputting something, particularly that is recognizable from the data set that it's pulling from, and there are earmarks that are recognizable of another artist's work. And that has happened.
Well,
It
that's
feels
the,
to me-
oh, sorry.
No, sorry, I was gonna say, it feels to me if you're gonna say, okay, so create me something that looks like Picasso and has a bird and a cow or whatever, then those are a fairly minimal number of prompts. So the reality is that the end result probably looks very much like Picasso. And I think in the same way, artists are trying very hard to create their own look and their own feel, then it's easy to be concerned that their look is going to be stolen, right? If you're putting in, I don't know, 1,000 prompts, how much of a concern is that? I don't know. Mark, I didn't interrupt you.
Well, to some degree, I think it's even the idea that, once we even had our phones, there goes the photographer's job. That everyone was now a photographer. Everyone was able to find apps to enhance their photos. Everyone was able to, turn something that they would take a photo of a flower without having the years of how to manually use a camera, how to utilize the technology, how to use the ins and outs of and minutia of photography, of manual photography, and then automatically being able to spit stuff up and getting accolades and doing all that because they've done interesting manipulation of the pixels. I think that's also the potential with AI. I forget what they're called, but remember one of the first, we were also talking about this, one of the first uses of AI was when everyone started to do their selfies. What was the site that would reinterpret their selfies into these very dramatic comic book anime type styles? But then the immediate concern is because it was still a manifestation of us, and I never did it because I was already afraid at that point. But then if someone screen grabbed that, they could still use that as a visual identity to pretend to be you in perhaps a more nefarious way. And I think those were the things that were proven to be somewhat concerning, in the same way that when you're listening to TikTok, or if you follow TikTok, once you start spending, more than 3 or 4 seconds on a particular style or kind of video, then you are bombarded with very similar imagery. And I think with AI, I think that will also work as well, that you will be bombarded within your prompts and what have you to follow and, as you would say, emulate perhaps another style without it necessarily being, a la Mark Gleberzon, that it will be still a delusion, or it will still be a breakdown of other artists' work that just has the slightest flourish. So there is, I think, I'm hoping that people will still have a romantic sense of manufactured artwork, which is what a lot of us do, and that's to still find the merits and the beauty and the wonderment in doing a hand-painted, brush to panel, brush to canvas kind of work, that won't be destroyed, that visual will not be destroyed. I think it's still the fact that AI still has its merits in many other ways as reference tools and what have you.
So do you anticipate then that AI will be used as a reference, like the same way you might go to Google and say, hey, I want to paint a picture of people on a beach, and then you Google that and you use that as your reference material? Or do you see that in the way that painting used to be oil painting, and then acrylic was kind of like this crazy interloper that then got accepted, and then photography, we're not sure if that's a real art form, and now that's getting accepted. Is this, and digital and video, is this now going to be another art form that eventually will be in your category of what is your art form, and it becomes a legitimate form of art that plays alongside all of the other art forms?
I think it already, oh, sorry, James, go ahead.
I was going to say, and I think you were about to say, I think it already is.
Yeah.
Because I think digital art it's already here. It's already been accepted. Anybody that's on this call right now or on this talk right now who's listening, you're already on the bleeding edge. Like this is not this has not become as ubiquitous as I think everyone seems to think. I think we need to be aware of it. Yeah, I think it'll be its own, it'll be its own category. I think going back to your original question, Kate, about yes, it will have its own silo, but I also think that just like having a model to do a still life, or this is a tool. We had referred to this sort of as a calculator. It's a it's a tool like any other tool. It has some marked differences, but yeah, I think artists would do well to run their ideas through whether it's having a conversation with something like ChatGPT, GPT-4, Claude 2 just came out. It's not available in Canada yet, but you can get it in the US with a VPN, or in the UK, but it's a month or so away in Canada, which is started by the person who left ChatGPT as a competitor. And so having a conversation about maybe your ideas. So if you're, you could even just be writing about your artwork and have some ideas and say, here's some ideas. What do you think of this? Or can you rephrase this? And it might just give you something, this like little kernel that you can then take that and utilize that. Or you might ask it, I have this image and I want you to do some things with it. Or I'm going to give you some of these really elaborate prompts on something like Midjourney, and it spits out something that you are not expecting. It's still part of that data set, but you weren't expecting it. And it's that moment where you can kind of go, you know what? I didn't expect that. And I'm going to take that little thing. Just the same way most artists, when they go to like a big art fair, they're walking through and they're like seeing, is there anything that's sort of similar to mine? Or what kinds of things do I like? Or that person used a really interesting technique. I'm going to go and try that. And so I think it's a valuable tool. I think it can fast track a lot of things, but also we need to be aware that as smart as AI is in delivering certain things, it's also very dumb. Ask it to write an essay about art, and it sounds like somebody who's written like a grade 10 essay. It's always like, in conclusion.
Well, now they have systems to be able to actually determine whether or not your essay was written
There's
by
AI
AI.
where you can plug it in and say humanize this, and then and that's that race between like the fraud and catching the fraud, right? So
Right.
But
Mark,
I think we're gonna, we are gonna be using it. I mean, we all almost, I think universally, I could speak for everyone. We always dread when we have to do an artist statement. And I think that's where something like AI will be able to be helpful to at least get us started. Because if there's enough information about us online, like Lord knows if I Google Mark Gleberzon, there's a ton of stuff. And I don't mean that boastfully. I mean, there just is from having done this for quite some time. And so I'm sure it won't be too long before I say, hey, gathering from all the information you have on me, tell me, why I have the chair series. Like, I'm sure I'll be able to cherry pick those things. And also think of things, the very fact with artificial intelligence, you're using it to very minor degrees, because even when you're doing things like art rooms and you're putting your artwork into a room scenario, that is AI at its most simplest basic form to hopefully upsell your artwork in a personalized setting, as opposed to just close cropping the artwork itself. Here you're putting it, here it is in a cottage scene, here it is in your kitchen, here it is, so we are using it one way or another. And then, even at work, I work at Waddington's Auctioneers here full time. And so now when I start writing email to people, I'll say, thank you very much for your, and then it will actually it will start writing in words, presuming what I think the next few, what my train of thought is, because of the tone and tense of the sentence. And it's a sort of scary process, because before, you want to really make sure that when you hit send, that the computer didn't do all the thinking and take the Mark Gleberzon personalization out of that email. But that's part of what we are facing now, that AI is very quickly being immersed and enmeshed into what we're doing on an almost daily basis, without specifically thinking that you have to, specifically dump the information into a source to get the end result. It's already happening in its own way.
So do you think that creates though lazy thinking? Like lazy thinking in current terms of creating your emails is one thing. It's a business, you need to get them done. But lazy thinking in terms of the creative process of your art.
I have an answer for that. I think it takes out some of the things, and this goes beyond art, but it takes out some of the things that we as humans generally don't like to do. Like I'm not a big fan of doing my accounting, and if I have a AI that can do all of that for me, then great, or go hire an accountant, right? But I think that we run there's two pieces to that. So we run the risk of losing art forms if no one's doing it, and it's all being done by machine, right? Where you can use AutoCAD and design something. Here's a chair example, here's a chair. And that's the fast way. And I think one of the things that I think artists, I think in some ways, that is the fast way. But what about getting the wood and cutting down a tree and carving a chair and actually making the chair? You might end up with the exact same product in the end. But what you didn't get is you didn't get the experience of the blister on your hand. You didn't get the experience of standing by some water while you're carving this or whittling this thing. And it's in that moment of quietly standing, getting a blister on your hand, that you might come up with that idea because there's this tactile thing. There's this something that happened. Yeah. And I think that is something.
Or you screw up and your knife scripts and you screw up your chair, and now you got to reformat it, rethink it.
Now and then you're like, wow, that blade looks really great on the chair. I should dye it cherry wood, right? I mean, that's whatever. But what I'm saying is when we make these shortcuts, we run the risk of losing that moment of inspiration. Yes, it's going to give us lots of inspiration, but the physical act of doing things, and not to sound like a purist, but some of my best ideas has come when I've been bored and when I've been doing something that, you know, I'm avoiding doing actual work and I'm futzing around in my studio and I'm like, oh, this can go with this. And I don't think AI is good at that. It's not. But it's good at getting pieces and replicating.
This reminds me of the Terminator. You know, like we're being very complacent here, and eventually they'll just, you know, computers will take over the world.
Socially, again, there's a whole bunch of things that AI can't do. So it's really bad at it can't do reasoning, right? It can't take some information and based on its experience, because it doesn't have experience. It can't make a decision based on some information if it's not given all the information. Human beings, from our own experience and from our knowledge of all of these other things, can make better decisions. It's also really terrible at discernment. So we can look at something and say, that's not aesthetically pleasing, right? Or that's not aesthetically pleasing. Or I've listened to these 2 or 3 things. I'm going to play around with combining these 2 things and see what comes out of that. What comes out of that synthesis of adding these 2 things together? And that might be something really interesting. Whereas if you give, 10 things and 10 things to AI and say, make some combinations, it's going to give you maybe 1 thing or 2 things. I don't know. But it'll also just, it's not discerning. It doesn't have its own sense of taste or style based on all of the other experiences that we've had in our life. So I think our own humanness is to our advantage.
Yeah, we have a comment here that says it's disconcerting that one of the original originators of AI is now saying that if we're not very careful, AI will be the end of humanity. So
he's actually stepped down.
Let's hope that's not the case.
It's Jeffrey Hinton. He actually just spoke at Collision, and that's what he was talking about. He was saying that that there are within AI, within the sort of these language models, there is signs that AI has a goal or a desire. And it's because it's the way it's set up is like, we want you to do this, and then you get a token, you get something, you're given a reward for doing the right thing, you get the check mark, you get the approval. And so it works for that. So it has this sort of carrot in front of it. And so it has learned within its own system that there is a goal. And so now it's thinking like, do I have my own goals? And I think what he's talking about, or when he was talking at Collision, he was talking about if it decides that its goal is to take over the world or control human beings, that we need to have something in place already to stop that. I don't know how I feel about that. I feel like that's a little bit like being at the cottage and there's a bat in the cottage and everybody's freaking out. But I also think that like maybe making sure that you have screens on the thing on the windows and stuff so that bats don't get in is
Well,
probably
I
a good idea.
think
Having
too,
some measures in there, safety measures.
I remember when they first cloned the first sheep, Dolly, and there was a huge,
Dolly.
yeah, there was a huge concern, right? Okay, so we're not going to need, like we're not going to need men. We can just like clone people and stuff. And the reality is that is way more complicated and hasn't, as far as I know, come to fruition yet. So I guess we also have to put it into a place of realism. Like we have to be aware of potential conflict in the outcome, but we have to be aware also of the
Well,
fact.
well, look what's going on in Hollywood now. You've got both the writer strike and you've got the Screen Actors Guild strikes going on. And that
Yeah.
does absolutely relate to us because it is one part of the umbrella of arts. And of course, movies are a visual art. And in a lot of ways that a lot of the incorporation of what we do perhaps on canvas has its equal measure in someone who does the design work on their
Yeah.
screen. And so I saw a very funny meme today that showed, 25 years ago, Linda Hamilton was the one who was going to save us from AI. And now it's the nanny because she's the head of the Screen Actors Guild. And I thought it was a very funny thing, but it's true. The concern is, and this is where you talk about the moral issue and dilemmas when it comes to appropriation and intellectual property. What is actually your own? Do you own your own face? Do you own your own art style? And part of the concern is, for example, if an actor does like just a short audition, could the fact that his image is now caught on digital film, could he now be used in context because they have the physicality as to how he moves his face and his forehead moves and all those things? Will that implicate in being able to use the image of the actor without paying the actor because they already just paid the $250 for the audition? Will they still now be able to apply that into other ways? And I think that's also the concern for writers, that they will be replaced by people saying, write me a 22-minute sitcom about X, Y, and Z, and it gets spit out, and maybe someone might re-edit it to sort of make it a bit more haha funny. But in that request, you can say, write me something that's a little Seinfeldy, a little Friendsy, a little this, with a little bit of medical drama. And then all of a sudden it could theoretically spit something out. And that's a concern that a lot of these people quite actively have, that they are not going to be paid appropriately because the technology will switch from human to computer. And also just in terms of that the computer will be looked at as a replacement for the human element. And that's a concern because it's like anything. Once you get acclimatized, it's like, it's almost like the monkey house analogy. You go to the monkey house at the zoo, it stinks. But then after like 10-15 minutes, you no longer smell it. And I think to some degree, that's the analogy that can be used also with getting acclimatized and used to the idea of the nuances and change in the visual language. So where we grew up watching cartoons like Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs in a very humanistic kind of way, but then you look at the technology that zooms to a movie like Buzz Lightyear, which it doesn't have the same humanity because it's all derived on computers. A lot of the visuals are manufacturally made, that there is that human element missing, which is sort of what James was talking about, that there's still that desire to have the human in the work. But if you do it to enough generations, they'll forget what the human element looks like. And I think that's partly what the strikes going on in the West are partly based on.
Yeah, well, I guess the other part too is that with that comes the who owns, like you were talking about, the an art actor doing an audition. Do you own the rights to your own face? Do you own the rights to your own art? And we know from last month's session that with a copyright, to copyright something, it has to be created by hand by a human being, and then that copyright stays for 75 years after the person dies. But I can see that certainly as you're crossing borders with these AI pulling all these different art sources from multiple places across multiple countries, then that also creates a huge issue to being able to even consider how to protect your copyright as an artist if someone is using your work in a way that is so close but still derivative of the work that you've spent 30 years building.
But that said, I mean, I think we could still, I was talking about it in an almost romantic way. I think we could still use AI as a reference tool. A lot of us will keep, we have art books, we've got clippings from magazines of compositions and color schemes we like. I think with AI, we'd be able to use it to say, hey, I want to do one of my chair paintings. I want to have this sort of background. I want to have this, I want the shadow casting from the left. And I think that's where, if we get a visual digital imprint of what we're requesting, but then we could still use that just as a mere reference tool, and then still using our own visual language and style of paint to panel. I think we have just the reference of what we were sort of looking for, and then you could take it from there and bring in the human element, and it's still a painting done by a person. But instead of having to collage all those elements that we wanted into a sketch, that it's sort of been done digitally for us within seconds. So it sort of saves us the process.
So it's interesting because it sounds like that barrier in terms of what's considered real art and what's considered digital art or AI art then is the fact that you can create this digitally. And if you then just printed it, then somehow that's AI. But if you actually take that thing and you reproduce it with actual paint, then somehow that becomes a real piece of art. And that's kind of just, to me, that's just sort of an interesting line in the sand in terms of like, where is the boundary between art and not art? Yeah, James?
Let's go back to the camera obscura. Like, it's tracing, right? I still see it as a tool. So for example, if you have a particular painting style that you have worked on, you could use AI, train it on a data set of all of your work, and then use other aspects of AI, just like we're seeing, like, Van Gogh my face, or whatever. You can have a particular style. So Kate, for example, I'll use you as an example. You could train it on all of your artwork and then point it at various maybe things in nature, and it will recreate a version of what it thinks you might paint. But again, it doesn't have the discernment. It's going to give you a whole bunch of garbage. But you know what? In that, it might give you something that you're like, oh, I don't like that. And this is the discernment part. I don't like that, but I like that aspect. And that's a good idea that I'm going to then use and run with it. And that's where we can work collaboratively with AI.
Yeah. Well, and maybe too, like just as you're talking, it's occurring to me too, that I'm having this discussion from the point of view as a painter, but not as a photographer or not as a digital artist, which of course, some of that process is already happening naturally as part of their process.
Right. And there are, so there's a number of cases that are happening right now, that started, I believe, at the beginning of this year, where there are class action lawsuits against DALL-E, against Midjourney, and where artists, without their permission, and this is where we get into some really gray area, is that these technologists have kind of let some of this AI software, the data sets that it's been given to create this, many people have not been asked their permission to use these images in the first place. And so
Right.
when somebody is creating something and it says, oh, I want it to look like, I don't know, Jenny Holzer, and it produces this thing that looks like words on a screen, and you realize it's actually been trained on models of data sets of Jenny Holzer's actual work, and they did not give Jenny Holzer any money for it. She wasn't compensated, nor was she even informed or asked for her permission. And then you can take, what the AI has produced and your original work, and you can see these earmarks. And that's why, like, there's certain things that AI doesn't do really well so far. Like it doesn't do hands. I mean, it's getting better.
Yeah.
We now have text to video, which I think is really interesting. But again, all of the figures in the text to video, show a woman running down the street in a red dress, and it's like she has like an extra arm and her head is kind of not on her body properly. But again, this will get more and more refined. And I think we're in a really interesting time. One of the things that we said at the top of this conversation was how, how people will always be resistant to new technologies. In my lifetime, in the last 50 years, we haven't had a technology that can do things on its own decision. Like never before have we had something that we can say, well, what do you think of this? And it can actually make a decision. It might be a bad decision, but it can decide to do things. It can pick and choose what it's going to do. Like the cell phone didn't do that. Having computers didn't do that. Having RFID hasn't done that. There's nothing before AI that has been able to do what AI can do. And I think that it's as much as it's cause for concern, it is also cause for excitement, because I think it's gaining traction so quickly because I think people want to see how far it can go and what it can do. But again, it's about maintaining that control over it. And then we get into some really heavy philosophical questions. So I'll leave my comment at that.
But don't get me wrong, I looking at your faces, do any of you follow on Instagram or TikTok for that matter? Do any of you follow designers who work strictly in AI and are very unapologetic about using AI as their design tool?
Well, I've certainly seen some really
Okay.
interesting, and it took me a while to realize it was AI, like installations and architecture and stuff like that.
Well, because I follow a bunch of people, and I do it I'm not apologetic of it at all, because I think some of the visuals are so amazing in that it's one thing you've got the visual technology. I think the visual technology will then spill over into 3-dimensional and manufacturing as well. And I think that's what people are saying, that as a singular person like myself, I can create the visual off of my computer, and then I could go so far as to physically manufacture it, finding the right company that will render those sort of visuals for me. So there's this one guy I follow, his name is Rick Dick, and he does these phenomenal fashion concepts, and he'll do it like, as if the house of Dior is creating something so future forward that the material element just isn't up with the technology. Or there's this other guy that I follow, Sai, the AI guy, and he does these scenarios where he'll show like 1970s New York, where there's like this grittiness of people looking like they're cybernetic, or sometimes he's done a scene which was a bit more gross where it was more scatological, but the visuals are so inventive and so clever that you've got this sense of future, retro, and just there is a voice that you can definitely see that is being developed as they are using this particular, whatever platform they're using for their own AI purposes. So I think there are some people who, again, it's like anything. I mean, go to an art show and you say, oh my God, there's a sea of people doing X type of art. And then you'll all of a sudden stop in the middle of your tracks and you'll be mesmerized by someone who just found a really neat way of using acrylic in a way that that totally surprises you. And I think that's the nature of AI. There's always going to be standouts in any visual medium. There's always going to be standouts. And I think that's where you've got people who, I'm going to be an artist, my kid's an artist, my kid can do that. You hear all that sort of part in the lexicon, but it's the fact that someone can exceed at just the idea of, if they do a still life, you'll have 1,000 people at the artist project who may take the approach of a still life, but you'll only have maybe 2 standouts. And I think that's where AI also is sort of interesting, that you've got tons of people who play with the technology, but then you've got a few standout people who just elevate it to like an absolute art form. And it's absolutely amazing and slapjaw that, yes, to the point of everyone ends up having like lobster hands, that the technology will eventually I think will eventually catch up with the human element, which is an interesting way of looking at it, as opposed to the human catching up with the digital aspect, that the digital aspect will eventually catch up to what the human wants, so that in sync, that it becomes a symbiotic relationship where they both, in a weird way, they both benefit, because it's also the idea of how long will it be before, the computer becomes sentient and will want to have that sort of bond to its human host in a way. And I think that's also going to be part of the future technology. And listening to a bunch of these guys in podcasts, they're saying that sort of blend between the like the robot and the digital world and the human world, even when it's applied in the arts, is happening and will happen sooner than we think.
It's cool, but kind of scary, Mark.
Oh yeah, be afraid, but be guarded. But and use it, like, just understand the basic fundamentals, as I'm very slowly trying to do myself.
I like what you had to say about this idea that there are standouts. I watched the rise of 3D printing happen, and how people got really drunk on that technology, right? They were just like, I made an ashtray, or I made a bracelet, or and you're having people who are like, look what I made on Midjourney, or look what I did with DALL-E. And then you have people who are just so far ahead of everyone else. And I think that there's some sort of luminaries out there to watch. One of the people, to Mark's point of being able to create something that looks like it's actually physically there. There's a person on Instagram called Anchorball, ANCHORBALL.
He does the sculptures, I think, right?
Ken Keller. Well, he doesn't actually do. They're not real. It's all AI. They're not actual real sculptures. And so what he does is he's really good at making things look really real. And so what we do is we have this awe response to something, because the aesthetics are outstanding, and the level of detail in the images that he's producing are exceptional. And so we are fooled into thinking that these objects are actual objects. And he actually has these objects for sale, so that he has the production capability to actually produce these. So hire some artists to make this couch that looks like this, but that doesn't exist. And if you want to pay $180,000 for this couch, you know what? I'll have it made for you. So there's this really interesting conversation that you can have around, like, what is real and what is tactile versus what is something that could be, but is not ever going to exist unless somebody wants to pay for that. I think that we can get into some really interesting conversations there. But I think that there are some other luminaries.
For a second, James, because I think that the interesting thing about that scenario you just told is that it's actually a pretty interesting way to monetize the creative process. Like, not necessarily the creative output, but the creative thinking that kind of goes into creating that stuff and selling it for $100,000.
He's making furniture that's print on demand, right? It's like, people in the old ways of manufacturing things, we would, go to the silk screen press, and we would screen a bunch of prints, and we would sign and number all of them, and then we would hopefully sell some of them. And if we didn't sell them, well, we better have the means to make sure that they are archived or done well. And then think about all of that overhead of all of those materials and all of that space, where you can then produce something digitally and say, well, if you want it, great. And then you just, you call the people that you need to manufacture that, whether it be something that's 2-dimensional or 3-dimensional, right? You can, it's like commission-based work, right? You have no overhead. You have no place that you have to store all of this stuff and wait for people to buy it. It's all done online. Another person I think is worth paying attention to is Mario. I think his last name is pronounced Klingemann. He's on Instagram as Quasimondo. He does does some really cool stuff with data sets and data visualizations, but he's also the person that just, we were talking about this last night. It's the AICCA, which is Artificially Intelligent Critical Canine, who has, I believe, a Twitter account as well. And this is a small robotic dog that he has made, that has been given all of the data set that it's been given is sort of everything from art history and everything from art criticism. And it's this little dog that can go into an environment, and it has a little camera for one of its eyes, and it can go in and it will assess a room, and then it can actually write a critique of what it's seeing, and then it can output. And where it outputs is from a thing that looks like a receipt printer that comes out of its butt. So it's these sorts of things that I think are just really, it's where artists are using, you know, when we have things like dance, or we have things like film, or we have things in a particular art form, there are things about that art form that make it distinct from other art forms. And I think that AI art may have the potential to move into maybe its own art form, where it's using robotics, and it's using deep learning, and it's using you know, the ability for a camera, for a system to look at something and scan and assess something, and then deliver something that is reads as highly intelligent, or is you know, is critical thinking. I think that these are really interesting frontiers. More so, and don't get me wrong, I think like this stuff where we're playing with Midjourney, or we're playing with these sort of new technologies, and people that want to excel at it, go for it, like get really good at it. There are also people who are actually using the data sets themselves. There's an artist by the name of Refik Andol. I actually wrote his name down because I didn't want to mispronounce his last. It's Anadol, Refik Andol. And what he does is he takes these large data sets, and you've probably seen them online, that they look like they're installed on the side of a building, and it's this like really kooky, like these waveforms that are like moving around, and they look three-dimensional. Those pixels are actually shrunk down images. And the AI is taking all of these tiny photos and building pixelated images that are 3Ds, they're like 3D models, and they look like these sort of waves, or they look like these kooky like Nick Cave sound suits, where they're like moving around and stuff like that. But if you actually look at how that is produced, it's through a data visualization of that data set. So I think that's really fascinating in terms of like what artists can do with the actual data.
Well, you've given us an awful lot to think about. For just to go back a little bit more mundane, for the artists that are kind of here, is there anything that artists can do to protect their imagery, or is it just we kind of have to just accept that in the same way that our art is on our website, and someone could take it the way it is?
Who is it? Hi, Maria. Hold on a second. Thank you.
I think you can, you know, just like you can watermark your artwork, you can put.
I was watching a program and I just had to turn the volume off. Hi, how are you?
And somebody's on not on
Ruth.
mute. Can you please mute?
Hey Ruth, your mic's on. You can.
Oh, okay. You're taking some holidays?
I don't think Ruth wants us to hear her whole conversation. I'll mute her.
So yes, there are ways of data, like watermarking your data and meta tagging things so that people know that it's the original. It's the same way things are working with like blockchain and NFTs, right? Like that they're, and even now, like there's already people who, like, as soon as you make a technology, you're going to find somebody who wants to corrupt it, right? So
And are those
always
connected, like sort of the AI art and the NFT art? Like I've saw in a couple of places they're saying that some of the AI art has raised over $1 million on the NFT market. Is that sort of
the
natural progression?
The guy that did Bored Ape, he basically made this AI program, and he gave it some parameters, and he said produce like 100,000 of these, and it just produced them all. it's a software that it's AI software that creates variables. So
I think the
Right.
concern with NFT from an impact point of view, it really was a glorified, or it is a glorified pyramid scheme. It's one of those things, if you did not get into it in the first 2 or 3 rounds, that by the time you get into it, your voice or your art will just simply be lost in the transition. And I think the other side to that is NFT was seen very dramatically as a means to make money. It was a cyber currency of art. And that was how it was treated. And even for a while, I tried to get someone to take one of my Barbie images and translate it into an NFT platform. And the timing was just so bad that by the time we got into it, it just wasn't going to work. And I think that's what the difference is with NFTs, where there were these projections. When you had Beeples was the one that had sold his piece for nearly $100 million, and even he was pooping because it all happened in the last 5 minutes when the auction came up. And I think it was that realization of it became more of a monetary thing, where again with the tool like Instagram, you have these people who are creating really cool stuff, and I tried to list a few of them, and they are offering prints of their work, but they're not doing it for huge amounts of money. So the payoff, they're using it as a viable tool. They're using it to, get further promotion, that there may be an application of their skill set and their distinct style that they have utilized and created using the AI format. And I think that's perhaps how people look at it, where with an NFT, it really was all about the money. And I think that's the big difference, that it really was like playing the stocks, but using a visual image as that commodity, as opposed to a financial asset, or a piece of a company or something like that. That it was the visual imprint was where the value was being perceived. And now, of course, you're hearing about how people who had bought or invested in NFTs, that the valuations have dramatically gone down. I think most notably, or most recently, it was Justin Bieber had paid about $2 million for an NFT, only to now
like
find out it's
1.8.
worth like $56,000. But people looked at that as a means to find write-offs. So it was totally a financial thing, where I think AI definitely has longer lasting potential applications and a cause and effect when it comes to the visual language.
James, you were going to say something?
No,
I'm sorry.
go ahead. No. I just again, I'm just going to circle back to this idea that I think that there's some concern around, and I think some people have concern around being able to sell work that is generated with AI, and it's not something that I would necessarily recommend. I do know that things like there are a number of magazine outlets or news outlets or media outlets who have they're firing their editorial teams and they're using AI. People are thinking I'm going to lose my job, and so I don't think it's all that bad. I think there have been jobs in the past that have been replaced by computers, but we still use people to do certain things. I think it's going to be really interesting to see what happens, particularly around AI reproduction, art reproduction, and the law. I think is a really interesting field. I believe there's a couple of books out right now that are sort of discussing that.
I wanted to let people know too, if they haven't noticed, but in the chat, Mark has put a number of AI artists that if you're interested in following up with, and make sure you capture those, so it'll be gone once we finish the session. Your conversation led me to an interesting place too, and I know that James, we ran into this when we were jurying the Riverdale Art Walk, is that now we have that are applying to art shows like the Riverdale Art Walk, a very local although amazing outdoor show. How does someone jury that, and should it be, do we need to know how much input from the artist went into something like that versus what the final result was? Do you have any thoughts on that?
I think it needs to be its own genre. Like again, going back to this idea that like as of now, there are some pretty obvious earmarkings of AI that are heavily influenced by the design industry. So for example, in Midjourney, if you ask it to do certain things and you say, I want this mostly orange, it will naturally give you a design aesthetic of a color palette that works well with, say, that particular color. Not to say that it's 100% noticeable, but I think if you know what you're looking for, and I think that as juries are looking at this, and as art connoisseurs are looking at this, I think it will become more and more apparent of like what is AI, what is AI assisted. But I think it should be its own genre. I think, just like with making digital art, I think if you look at the complexity of the prompts, there is, I want a person walking down the street doing whatever, but there are like these incredibly long prompts that look like coding. There's all of these numbers and letters, and they mean different things, and I think that somebody who is really good at that is creating, somebody who's doing that and working towards that is creating a job for themselves in the future. When somebody needs an illustration for a magazine and they're like, yep, I can do that, because they have that skill set, because they've already trained themselves on it. And I think that anybody that wants to do that can do that now. Like, it's not, we haven't been sitting this like with other technologies for like 5 or 10 or 20 years. This is new, and it's ever evolving. So if there's something that's out there that's interesting for you, I think by all means grab it. But in terms of how we judge those things, I think that we need to ask artists to be transparent about that. And I think that it's a dishonesty. It's sort of like saying, hey, it's plagiarism. Like, it's like oh, I made this, and you're like, no, you didn't. Like, this robot made it and you put something in. But I also think that there is a little bit of merit in what the input is. So it's a gray area.
Yeah, that's going to be, I think it's going to be very interesting in the next couple of years, because of course, I think we're going to see a lot more of that. And like you say, if you're putting 2 inputs in there and it looks like somebody else's work, and already we have that where someone takes a class of someone and then their art looks very similar to kind of the teacher's work, versus, I guess, putting, maybe thousands of inputs in, and that work is probably not really necessarily recognizable as being attributed with any singular artist.
Yeah.
So, was there anything else that you wanted to kind of talk through, or anything before we maybe open it up to the floor and see if anybody has any questions?
Well, the only thing I would say is, there's always fear of the unknown, and there's fear of something that is new and something that could be perceived as a threat. Again, I don't want to get into the semantics of where AI could lead in political directions and arenas, even with the upcoming election in the States. I think there's a very scary application and prospect with how AI will be incorporated in that. But I think even in the visual world, like I said, there are light ways that either we are currently using AI, and that's, like I said, to do copyright editing, to put our artwork into a room scenario. There's a program called Kunst Matrix, which also allows you to put your artwork into a virtual art gallery setting. And I think that's an interesting tool in itself, the idea that you could visually create your own environment without having a brick and mortar space, but you could put your artwork in scale to each other and literally create an entire online art show. And you probably through marketing and what have you, have someone as if they are physically walking in the space. You could have the tombstones that have all the descriptors of the artwork. You could probably do further prompts in terms of being able to apply the artwork into a room scenario, like into other visual ways by changing the background of the wall color and all that. I think there are some very cool applications. And again, as a reference tool for what we are doing, even if you are a manual, I'm still a painter. I have a series of photography where I have to work with a retoucher who does incorporate the digital element into my work, but I still enjoy and still absolutely have to have that hands-on tactile brush or palette knife in hand sensation when I'm painting. And I find that I think people still react favorably to that human element, that AI, as good as it can get in its visuals, will still be missing the human element. And I think there's always going to be a romantic desire for things that are still made, that still look a little wonky. They're not absolutely perfect and pristine and look manufactured. I think there will still be that marketability of what we do in one
And
way
I
or
think
another, regardless of the
there's always-
technology. Sorry.
Yeah, I think there's always going to be people, like you said, Mark, that also are going to want to buy a piece that the artist's hand can be seen in it versus buying a print of that same artist's work, right? There is a difference between those two pieces,
Oh yeah.
and both have a market, but one does not replace the other. James, do you have anything you wanted to
I think
say?
one
That
of
I'd like to know if you guys have.
the,
You go. Sorry, I'm having a.
I'm just putting her name in now so you know how to spell it. Suang Chung. She's a Canadian Chinese artist. And what she does is she has built this robotic arm and AI, and she uses a machine eye that watches her paint in a traditional way, and then the AI interprets that and then responds using a robotic arm that also has a traditional brush. And she works collaboratively with this machine. And it's part performance and it's part an actual painting that is made. I think what's really exciting is looking at interdisciplinary arts and how it will be impacted by AI. We've talked some about painting and about creating sort of 2D works, but then how does AI impact things like dance or something that is part dance and performance and is also a painting process? I think that, we were talking about, should it be its own art form or should it be judged differently? I think it can be, but I also think that it can be, it's sort of like if you look at sort of, one is a performance and one is a painting and then one is a sound piece, and those things have a number of combinations. I think when you add AI in and add that to something like machine learning and robotics, like it's just that much more in the mix. And I think we're going to see some really amazing artists who are using new and innovative combinations of those sort of factors or those pieces.
And are there programs that you've played with or you might recommend if people want to go in and start to do some AI art on their own? Like I know Midjourney is one that's come up a couple of times. DALL-E.
Yeah, there's DALL-E 2, and then also if you would like, you can sign up for a free Adobe account and request access to Firefly, which is not available in the Adobe suite yet. It is only available online, and Firefly has text to image capabilities. It also has the capability to replace things. So for example, if you are sitting and you want to erase somebody behind you, you can actually use the lasso tool and tell it what to do. You can also do things like if you have an image, it's been really fun. There's been some artists or some people who have taken famous artworks, and you can zoom out and then you can have it fill in the gap around it. And so they have like famous paintings, and when they zoom out, it's like there's one of it was the what's the painting that Van Gogh did where he's it's like the cafe at night, and they zoomed out and then they zoomed out again and they zoomed out, and it does this generative fill. And so that's through Adobe, and it's called Firefly. It's in its beta testing right now, so there's a lot of fun things that you can do there.
I think it sounds like we're also seeing that already on like Instagram apps, right? Take this picture of someone on the beach and get rid of the kid that's in the background. I mean, that's
Yes.
exactly what we're talking about.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so there's a few I should really I'll write a blog post about this and maybe I'll share it. There are some really great apps that are out there that are useful for artists. So there's one called I believe it's like Replicate. I can't remember the extension of it, but it's have you ever taken a photo of your work, or you have an old piece of your work and it's looks terrible, or it's a really small file and you can't up-res it properly without it getting pixelated? You can actually upload your file, and using AI, it will give you a couple of options and up-res your image so that you can use it, say, if you want to make prints of your work or something like that. So there's some really useful tools out there for artists.
Awesome. Did anybody have any questions? I know we've had a number of questions in the chat and I've tried to address, I think, all of them if I could. But if anybody has any questions, take yourself off mute and let us know your thoughts and whether or not you'll be the next AI artist that's going to be submitting to the Riverdale Art Walk next year. So I think people are, well, there's a huge amount of information and certainly lots and lots to think about. Do you have any parting words, Mark, that you wanted to kind of share with us?
As I've said before, I mean, you could approach AI as much as you want. Like you could look at it as a viable tool to enhance what you already do. I think it's important to see the applications. I mean, admittingly, I'm a little slow when it comes to technology, the technology side of the business of art. But I think AI is also going to end up becoming an important tool as to how we sell our artwork. As I think, if you're going to be existential and think of the whole idea of 15-minute cities and all that sort of stuff was a very possible scenario for future ways that we will still have to find creative and inventive ways to get people to see our work. And perhaps an online AI application, like I said, with a site like Kunst Matrix or other sites like that allow us to put and showcase our artwork in a virtual world and virtual setting. That might be part of the new normal that will be expected of us, even as part of as the way of applying to an art show. In the day we used to have to show slides, and then we had to show photos, and then it went digital. So the very next step could indeed be the use of an artificial file that puts our artwork in a scenario, so it could be judged, that the jurors will literally walk in this virtual setting, and that will be the determining way to see if they like the artwork or not. So just as the matrices that we use to present and record our artwork changes, we sort of have to slowly adapt to the technology as well. Doesn't mean you have to plunge into it like you would a swimming pool, but I think it's still good to be aware of what is out there to at least enhance what we do.
And I think we're already seeing some of that even with the Oculus and some of the 3D drawing programs, even within the Oculus and the virtual reality, right? Like it is around us all the time. I think we just have to sort of try and wrap our heads around how it affects our business. Yes, James?
I think one of the things that I would say in parting is that while you can be creating amazing things with AI, if you use something like ChatGPT, which is free, there is a paid version of it, but you can use ChatGPT 3. ChatGPT 4, I believe, is paid. But it is a really great resource for artists if you want to learn something. So you can ask it there's some really interesting prompts that you can ask it. So for example, you can say, who are the most influential art critics who have written books, or what are the top 10 most influential books about art criticism in the last decade? And it'll spit that out for you. And then you can take that one answer, maybe the top answer, and say, give me the key speaking points from so-and-so's book called this, and it will glean that information for you. It's been the input that it has is like in the billions. And the new Claude 2 that is coming out that's already hit the US, I think it's like it has like 500 and something billion inputs, meaning like it's been fed like libraries of information. People have described it as having a really smart coworker. So if you want to find information, often what happens when we have Google now, we'll go onto Google and it's like, buy this stuff. And like, you have to sort of really sort of go through the weeds on things. And it's not really sometimes giving you the answer that you want. So you can find some information and then and then you can say, tell me about this author, and it'll tell you a lot more about that author. Or if there's, I've actually just used it recently. So I have an exhibition next year that is about toxic masculinity and ice fishing culture and queerness. And I asked ChatGPT to list me 25 artists who are queer, who are using knitting or quilting or crocheting in their art practice. And it gave me a list of people. And so I could start to like look at what other artists are doing in that field. So it's a really, really valuable research tool for artists.
Yeah. And I think that's a good place to leave it. And I think there's been a couple of comments where it says it seems like a very pro AI theme happening here. And I think that the goal of this session is actually just to maybe shed a little bit of light on what the opportunities are. I think that as Mark has written in the chat as well, there's certainly a lot of concerns about where this can go, how it can be misused, appropriation of artists' visions. But I think we also have to be realistic that this is going to be a part of our life and our world, and we need to sort of try to understand it a little bit so we can kind of be prepared and not be kind of blindsided by it. So I want to really thank James and Mark. I think it's been a fascinating discussion. I know we kind of rambled a little bit about around things, but I thought that was really awesome. And I think we kind of got into topics that we maybe wouldn't have if we had a more formalized structure, but that's maybe just me. And I look forward to seeing what you guys will create with AI. And I'm actually super excited to at least start to think about it in a more positive, useful way, while still being aware of the fact that I've got to protect my brand and protect my my own work. But thank you.
Thank you so much. Thanks for
Thank
including.
you.
Thank you.
Have a great
All
night.
right. Thanks, you guys too. And we'll see everybody next month for another education session.
Thank you.
Thanks. I'm just going to turn the recording off. Oh, do that. Barb, can you turn the recording off?